How do you think, and this is a pretty heavy question, but how do you think cooperation can happen between, different factions going on in our lives right now? I mean, it seems, to me, it seems like the time is so right for something like it to happen. When you see, all of the climate activists around the country, when you see Black Lives Matter, when you see, and connections are starting to be made.
Mm-hmm.
They're starting to make connections between police brutality and environmental racism and grassroots candidates. Like, all these kind of bridges are slowly starting to form, but I feel like we gotta build them quicker. I mean, what do you think are some keys to that?
And frankly, again, it gets to a lot of the same things we've been talking about the way the deck is stacked against us. It's a lot harder to build and sustain those bridges when the people that have all the money have no interest in seeing those bridges happen.
Right.
It's easier for them to double down on fear around Black Lives Matter and play on that because there's more money to be made in advertising to people's fears. A media that's based primarily around chasing audiences for money is not really going to be our friend in movement building. We simply do not have the kind of media that we used to have. And even there, it was always problematic. I mean, it was never very much the on our side here, but it's harder today just because of the massive consolidation that we've seen from starting in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. It's gotten worse. I mean, it was always there, even in the 60s. It was better comparatively speaking. When you go back before the 20th century, we had a very interesting media structure that I think in some ways was exemplary, in the sense that you had, all these different newspapers that different schools of political thought had, like everything from socialist to federalist and everything in between.
Yep.
And all of their newspapers were subsidized. So was our media structure perfect then? Of course not, because people could print whatever the hell they wanted. There was this crazy yellow journalism issue like we have now, by the way. That hasn't changed either. But media messaging didn't rely on your financial power.
Right. It didn't rely as much on the advertising. It was driven much more by our choices and what we bought. So it reflected more the interests of people. When the emphasis shifts over entirely to appeasing advertisers, then tons of voices get crowded out. I mean, we forget just how vibrant a lot of the discussions in this country used to be. Hell, Abraham Lincoln regularly read Karl Marx. Like there were like, he had articles and editorials published in U.S. newspapers, and he read them and corresponded with him.
Now, do you tell
just how broad that used to be?
The statement Abraham Lincoln would constantly read Karl Marx. Here's a pragmatic question for you. Do you regularly tell your students that? And if so, how many parents complain?
Honestly, I never have to deal with parents. I guess that's one advantage of teaching at college instead of high school.
Fair.
But I do, and I challenge my students to read things from a wide variety of perspectives. And I think that that's the only way to come to really good conclusions on your own. So people absolutely should read right-wing economists and left-wing economists. Like, read the stuff and think through them if that's what you're trying to do. And again, I teach at college, and the whole point of like the liberal arts education is, I don't know, like creating the quote-unquote leaders of tomorrow. So you're trying to teach more critical and independent thinking because they have to be able to make those decisions. Sadly, just as a basic way in terms of like basic structure, we've set up primary and secondary education to more or less be indoctrination. It's kind of funny that the right is so obsessed with like colleges being indoctrination factories when it's literally opposite. My job is to unpack and dismantle indoctrination and let people make their own critical decisions. So yeah, I do tell them exactly that, and I do challenge people to read a wide variety of perspectives so that they can find their own footing.
Well, and you find too, when you read in between the line or just read the entire text, sometimes it's not what you were told it was. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking of real quick here is Adam Smith.
Yeah,
if you sit down and read Wealth of Nations, I mean, I once, like, whenever I would talk about, more, conservative or libertarian people and stuff like that would come up, I'm like, look, if Wealth of Nations came out today, it would be considered a left-wing book, and Fox News would hate it because there's over 600 pages and no pictures.
And there's actually a lot more in which people like Marx and Smith agreed than disagreed.
Right.
Their perspectives are a lot closer. And it's funny that Smith himself considered his greatest work to actually be his theory of moral sentiments, not Wealth of Nations, which had laid out a kind of like sympathetic understanding of our perceptions of other people. Like, I see that you are sad and I don't want you to be sad, so I'll do something about that, which, if you take seriously that kind of Enlightenment perspective, then the sort of predatory capitalism you saw develop in the 19th century couldn't have happened. You wouldn't have been like, yeah, I don't care if my workers get their arms cut off and get poisoned by all the mercury in here, like, because I would see that they're suffering and not let it happen. Smith really had a kind of a massive blinder, as an Enlightened figure about human nature. But he did see a lot of the potential damage from capitalism as a system, and heavily opposed what we would call corporations today.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
They were a disastrous idea that, he was like, oh, hell no, joint stock companies are a disaster. We should, find some way to restrain the development.
He was closer to worker cooperatives.
Yes, exactly.
He was pretty much right there. I mean, when you look at what he actually called for, a small wage gap between, I guess what you would say in contemporary sense, CEO. He didn't put it that way. He just said, like, bit owner or whatever.
A small
wage gap.
Your bourgeois class. Yeah,
bourgeois, a small wage gap between the owner and the worker. Power in the workers' hands, living wages. I mean, yeah, it was so much closer to Marx than, say, Ayn Rand. And so many people just don't know that, or choose to ignore it because of a couple cherry-picked quotations.
And closer to what we'll see in actually the Scandinavian model. Or really in most developed countries Japan is even better in some respects this way, like where the wage gap between your executives and your common workers is 10 to 20 times. So you're still making millionaires, but it's a little bit more reasonable a difference than 400 times, like where we are. Smith would have been outright calling for revolution looking at our economic system. It's nothing like what he would have described.
So, well, on that, and then we'll close out here because this conversation is getting so nerdy. You might not be able to win. I'm doing you a favor. It's just like oh geez, these two, Jesus, they're gonna go on. But one popular misconception that I feel is just so totally apparent is that we were taught this outright lie, and when you look at history, it doesn't align with what is taught in society. That the whole idea of a marketplace of goods and services cannot exist without a capitalist structure. That's abhorrently false. And it's just so blatantly false. And people have entertained this lie, some of them for their entire lives and their entire career. Some people have built academic careers on it, even, as I'm sure you know.
No, it's a clever piece of propaganda, actually, to get people thinking that capitalism means markets. And it doesn't. Right. We've had markets for thousands of years. Capitalism is a few centuries old. At its earliest, you can trace it back into some high medieval developments in the Arab world, but it doesn't start developing the shape that we would recognize until like the Italian city-states in the early modern period. You can push capitalism back maybe 5 centuries. We've had markets as long as there's been any kind of exchange between people. So literally since we settled, markets are 10,000 years old. And there are whole, strains of thought on what are called like market socialists, for example.
Yes.
Realistically, though, I think that one of the problems that we have in our current political system in the US, and one of the things I think plays into the hands of the right, is this whole contrast between capitalism and socialism. I would prefer to toss the entire paradigm as a legacy of 19th century arguments that just doesn't really reflect where we are in the 21st century, where technologically speaking, we're moving toward the ability for an entirely post-scarcity society. Technologically speaking, we could feed and house and clothe and support everyone easily. We're just choosing not to. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that either the capitalists or the socialists in the 19th century really were expecting. It didn't really fit their understanding of our relation to labor and goods and everything else.
Well, I think that, I think that these terms can have their usefulness just kind of as a resource point and as a jumping off point. But they've been redefined and reassociated and reassessed so many times that even just one that's popular here in the United States, democratic socialists, that means a different thing around the world. Absolutely. That's not the same thing. In some places that means social democrat, in other places it means something totally different. And these terms can be...
A democratic socialist is someone who wants to win an election and then abolish private ownership of the means of production. It's not at all what people are often campaigning on in the US when they're calling themselves democratic socialists, although some are. Many of them are actually what we would consider like just centrist social democrats. Bernie Sanders' policies, his platform, have always been social democracy. Mm-hmm. Whether or not he's actually a socialist, that's up to him. I wouldn't know what's in his head, but his policies, his rhetoric, what he's been arguing for is mainstream social democracy. And when he points to like the Nordic countries and the Nordic model, he's talking about a kind of free market capitalism, but with the welfare state and the kind of like Smithian restraint of corporations.
Right.
He's not talking about socialism at all. But when he uses the term, what he does is he hands ammunition to the right that can say that Bernie wants gulags. Bernie is a Stalinist, which is just so far from the truth. It's just a joke if you know what the words mean. But sadly, we really don't. I mean, most Americans don't even understand our own form of government anymore because we've abandoned civics education in the last couple of decades, much less understand the nuances of political philosophy.
I think the other side to that, though, and I'm not saying that, I have my disagreements with some of Bernie's strategy, some things I like, some things I don't, as far as like what he's done contemporarily. But to the point you made about him identifying as a socialist, one thing he has really done that I think is actually a positive is he has taken a lot of the stigma away from that word.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other side of that. He has taken, you have young people identifying as socialists now, and they're doing reading into what that really means, which I think that's a positive thing. That's where it's like these starting points are actually helpful.
It is. It ends up being problematic with a lot of conservative areas. And if, again, we want to regain a lot of the state houses and governor's mansions that we've lost, if we want to go back to, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives for almost 40 years with few breaks. And today we struggle to hold it at all. It's always right on the edge. And they have actually the Republicans have a significant advantage. And some of the rhetoric here is exploitable on their side. When realistically, a lot of people, even when it does inspire them to go back and read the sources, and they're reading Bakunin and Marx and everyone else and thinking about this stuff and like, oh, you get radicalized by Chomsky or this or that, oftentimes still they're adapting it to a 21st century context. And it really isn't a lot like what these earlier situations were. The social circumstances have continued to change steadily. So in the long run, it might make more sense to find some kind of path forward that gets us talking about those core issues without some of the baggage that like shuts you down immediately. We have a hard enough time in a lot of these red areas just reaching someone as soon as they see, oh, you're a Democrat, that means a certain thing to them now. There's like a brand, right? And the brand that they have in mind for a Democrat doesn't really fit me.
So Liam, just saying, if we had a different viable alternative that wasn't called Democrat, could that potentially be helpful?
Again, there are serious structural issues to getting there, but
I know.
I was a Green for 25 years, but as far as I'm concerned, it was never going to go anywhere. I mean, I was pretty well aware of the odds against it ever happening anyway as a viable alternative, just again, because of not only the legal structure, but also the financial and institutional structure in the country here. I mean, but yeah, I would love it if we had an effective, thriving parliamentary democracy and a multi-party system where everyone's views could be reflected. We don't have that. We have two large tents that have so much disagreement within them that we should have 5 parties or 6 parties.
I'm with you. It's not an impossibility to build. I mean, I'm with you. We're both calling for very tall glasses of water, but the alternative is not trying.
I'll give you a way to do it. Here's an interesting idea, and something to your viewers as well. Find and support progressive Democrats that are running for office that are open in the same way that I am to those changes, and do that at the state house level and national level. And if you put enough people like that, we can change those laws. I would love to propose a change to our voting system that would make it possible to have a thriving multi-party democracy. But the voting laws don't allow it now. We have to change them at the state level and at the federal level. And that means finding those candidates and supporting them within the system so that we can essentially, in the long run, more or less dismantle it so we don't have this duopoly monopoly and we actually have a thriving free market in ideas again.
Well, let's end on this then, because this is something that Mike Gravel said that has really stuck with me. And he has a new book that really highlights these issues. He says one of the problems in contemporary American society is that people don't realize the actual power they do have. Mm-hmm. And I know that sounds like almost idealist, but when you really look into it, he's right, though. Because like we can have a people's legislature. The Declaration of Independence gives us that freaking right. Because you know what happened, Liam? And you can use this in your history classes. My theory that I don't know if anyone's been able to disprove. Now, they didn't write it this way, Liam, but that's because they wanted to hide this. But I think what happened was they had a big ass party. And that was where they wrote the Declaration of Independence. They were all hammered, right? That they were like, we're going to govern ourselves. We figured this out. And they were like, hey, John, do you want to sign this thing? And he was like, hell yeah, I do. And I'm going to sign it real big because the word cock is in my last name. Woo! And they had this big ass party, Liam. And they wrote all these awesome, we're going to be able to do this. The people can have their own legislatures. We're going to make our own laws. F you, England. Then what happened, Liam? They woke up hungover the next day, and all the people with the most power looked around, and they were like, some of us have land and slaves and shit, and we don't want to lose any of that. So they wrote the Constitution.
Right.
That's what happened, I'm pretty sure.
The Constitution is actually a pretty elitist document in many ways, but the principles that a lot of the founders have were pretty egalitarian. I mean, there are a lot of founders that had solidly Enlightenment principles. I love the party idea, like Washington grew hemp. You know,
no one could disprove this. No one could disprove this.
Who knows? I mean, they could have been. It could have been a rager, you know. But we do have power, and I think one thing that I point to, getting back to the elections, after all, since it is an election season here, I do try to point to that people power a lot, because it isn't just an ideal. It's idealistic, but it's also very practical. So think about this. I've been sipping a cup of coffee here, right? We will often look, and there's a kind of learned helplessness on the left, where we'll think that somebody can write a $20,000 check or whatever there. I can't compete with that. I don't have much money, so politics is corrupt, whatever. I'll stay out of it. If a few thousand people donate the price of one coffee a month, that's it. Set it up as a recurring. So it's every single month, $5. If most of us can afford $5, we can't afford to write $500 checks to all of our candidates, but we can afford $5 here and there. If you support progressive House candidates across the country and assembly members or whatever here with your $5 a month, a few thousand people doing just that is enough money to win almost any House race in this country. Most of them can be won with a lot less money than you think if you have the right candidate and strategy and you have enough money coming in. And most of us have $5. So if we can get past that sense that, well, my $5 doesn't matter, it's too little, it doesn't, I have no real power. And we say, no, we do have power. As the people, collectively, we have a tremendous amount of power, and we actually exercise that power. We can overturn a lot of these systems of corruption.
I'm with you, man. I'm with you, and I hope you're one of those victory stories.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news on with Ron.